been 3 weeks. So, all right. Well, let's get started with a word of prayer, and then we will get into class and get started. Dear God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the many blessings you give us, and we thank you for everything that you do for us. And we thank you for the freedom and the opportunity we have to come and to study your word, to worship you, to sing praises to you, and learn more about you. And I ask that you take what we learn today and we take it out into the world and use it to bring others to you. I ask that you be with us as we go through this class. Help us to, again, take what we learn about you and apply it to our lives to become more like you. And again, use that to bring others to you. And it's in Christ. Let me pray. Amen. All right. It takes a while sometime to get back in the swing of things after it's been a couple of weeks. I know Dad's going to do this, but we just want to thank everyone for all the prayers and everything for in the last couple of weeks. And I know Robbie and Kat and his family and a lot of the others out there expressed the same sentiment. We were talking about it a little bit ago. I think we had, probably close to 20 people, if not maybe more, who ended up with COVID, or their families ended up with COVID. So they had to take a necessary break, but it's good to be back. One of the things that I've done, so I spent a lot of time, I don't know, I'm the type of person, my brain likes to wander and run around and go a million miles an hour. And for some reason over the last couple of weeks, I don't know, with everything going on, I don't know, I know I posted it, I know some of y'all know that, I had asked for prayers for one of my good friends from high school, and he passed away from COVID. And then we saw several of our friends and stuff get this, and I don't know, it's just made me think a lot. I know there was a couple of nights where I was up till probably 2-3 o'clock in the morning, just my mind going with everything going on. And one of the things I decided to do with this class is I'm going to stick with, what I titled this the Jesus story, the story of Jesus, however you want to phrase that. But I'm going to push it in a little bit different direction. And at first it was more of I want to just study and look at Jesus in the early church and go through it. But I'm going to kind of reset that a little bit. And I want to go back and review. But I want to change the direction to focus on a little bit more of who Jesus was, but really bringing that into the world, especially today, and where we're at. And we're going to look at a little bit more of that as we get into it, because there's been, and there's going to continue to be, a drastic change in not only the world, but in our country, and in our generations, and just everything within the last almost 2 years now. We're coming up to close to 2 years, and so things look a lot more different. And I think things look a lot more different than we even realize. Maybe we do, but and so I think we need to really get to a point where we adjust and change and get prepared to that. And I think, as in anything, if we go back to the way Jesus was and truly was, then we can adapt and become who we need to be as a church for the times that we're going through. Because I'm going to be honest with you, and we're going to look about that. The church of before, the church of the previous generations, I'm going to word this as carefully as I can. The way things were done and the way the church was then will not work now. And I don't mean that to be in a negative sense. It's a completely different world. And so as a church, we have to adapt and change and become what we need to be for the current world that we and environment that we live in. And I think once we start going through this a little bit, you'll see what I'm talking about. So to reset and review here, I'm going to go back a little bit, and I'm going to kind of cover some of the things that I probably should have covered a little bit because when we first started, just because it's interesting, I think. But does anyone know, and before I flip to this next slide, does anyone know what Jesus' real name in the Hebrew is? Mindy, you know? Very good. Yes, I think it's pronounced Yeshua in the Hebrew. And typically that's translated Joshua. In the Greek, and I'm going to try to pronounce this. Dad might be able to do it better. I can't pronounce Greek words very well. I think it's is it Laesaus? Isaus? Laos? Okay. And so in the Greek, so and I don't know if it's really translated, it's more transliterated, but that translates into Jesus, or depending on how you pronounce it. In our English vernacular, it's pronounced Jesus. So in his day, he would have probably been more known as more of a Joshua. But again, these are just interesting facts. I don't think he really cares what you call him in an English word. But I just wanted to go back and look at it. And the reason I do is because a lot of times we bring these misconceptions forward of Jesus, and I think sometimes, and even a lot of the times we see things in the New Testament with the church, and we know our world that we grew up in and that we have established and the kind of the bubble around us, and we just expect things to kind of be like that, you know? And a lot of times they weren't. And so I like to point these things out as things have changed or as translations change and stuff like that of how that works. So I want you to picture Jesus. Now, when you picture Jesus, what do you see? Or what comes to mind? Blonde hair, blue eyes. Long hair? Anyone else? No, I know you, I know. Dark skin. See, now what's interesting, olive skin, you say that, but if you look at most of the paintings and pictures of Jesus, who is he? White dude with long hair, right? Yeah. And so it's interesting. Like I said, we've brought these pictures of Jesus because of what's, because what happens when you have a lot of artists from England or who are English, right, or from Europe, they're going to draw, and they're going to draw. When we draw, we tend to put reflections of ourselves into things, right? And so we do the same thing with a lot of not only when we do pictures. So a research company, I think this was in the UK, they were doing a genealogy study of the area where Jesus grew up in. And what they did is they took paintings and artwork and drawings from Jesus' time, and then the people who, and some pictures of the people who've been there and their generations go back a very far time, and they actually stuck all these into a computer, and they let the computer come up with, by taking all the facial characteristics and blending them all together, what they thought Jesus might have looked like. Now, I'm going to flip to this, and it's probably going to be different than what you thought. Let me see what you think. This is what the computer come up with. So how many people, when they picture Jesus, picture someone that looks like that? Okay, a few people. All right, so me, I thought it was interesting. I like that. I thought that was interesting. Kind of and the reason I like, one, I'm into technology, so anything that's technology-based I like. But the other thing is this takes the I guess bias or the human nature out of wanting to put our own characteristics into things when we create them. And so, I don't know, maybe that's close to what Jesus looked like. Maybe he looked completely different. Who knows? I mean, it's not important, but I think it's important for this study to kind of have an idea of, getting rid of some of our own misconceptions and going into it and saying, hey, this is what maybe he looked like, or bring it in. But anyway, I don't think these are important from a spiritual biblical standpoint, but because if it was important to know what Jesus looked like, it would have been described in the Bible. But I think this helps with us in a lot of ways. So what we did, we've gone back through and we've looked at a couple things. One, we looked at Jesus outside the Bible. And I think this is important to look at Jesus. Yeah, go ahead. Average, yep, yeah.
You know, I mean, he didn't have any qualities that caused him, as far as physical appearances, that caused him to stand out in a crowd, like say King Saul did, or David, or some of the other people that were described as very handsome in the Bible.
Yeah, and because of that, most scholars believe, like Dad just said, he would have been your average Joe, not someone who would have stood out in a crowd, anything like that. Just kind of a average guy walking around that you would see almost every day in that time frame. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you saw that face there, I mean, the only one, well, I'm going to go into, I watch a TV show called The Blacklist, and there's a guy that kind of looks like that on that show. But, yeah, but I mean, you saw him, I mean, it wouldn't be like, he wouldn't just stand out. It's like, oh my goodness, I've never seen anyone who looks like that before. Now, some of us get that dark after spending a good summer in the Georgia sun. So anyway, so we've looked at Jesus outside the Bible, and that's important because that helps not only establish what's inside the Bible, because we have at least 10 or more, there's more than 10, but 10 very well-known authors who wrote about Jesus and his ministry, and then the Christians after the fact that point back to who he was and what they were doing. And then after that, we looked at Jesus inside the Bible. And we looked at just kind of an overview and a recap of who he was and the things that he did. One of the things being is, and I think a lot of times we didn't realize this, or we don't study this a lot, I don't think, is that Jesus was really what we would consider from the wrong side of the tracks. Jesus didn't come up out of some, well-known noble family or, anything like that. He came from a teenage girl and I don't know how old they think Joseph was, but he wasn't that old, and he was born in more of a barn, and he came from a small town, and, of Nazareth, where nothing, the saying was that nothing good comes out of Nazareth. And so he just had this background that wasn't good, that didn't give him any fame. And then most people, because of where he came from, and he claimed to be a rabbi out of this area, they wouldn't have even humored that. So it's interesting to see that. And so I say all that to say that Jesus, we've kind of created Jesus sometimes in our own image, right? Is we read these things and we process them through, and this is human nature. I mean, you're going to do this because it's just the way we function, is you're going to process everything that you read, that you look at through your own lens and through your own world. And so what we have to do as we read this, we have to step out of that lens. We have to step out of that kind of bubble that we have, and we have to realize who he was in his time frame and not what we think it should be or should look like. So that's a little bit of the challenge, and we're going to continue to do that as we go forward. And then the other thing we looked at is that Jesus is Israel in person. He came down, he fulfilled all the things that was talked about in the Old Testament that was going to happen. And he showed, he kind of reenacted, or he did reenact, not kind of, everything that from the Exodus, them going through and going into the desert and all that stuff. He reenacted everything that Israel was, and then he perfected it. He showed it as in its perfect form of what it should be, and then he took, and we're going to look at this more, through his death and his resurrection, and broadened what was was just for Israel and opened it up to the entire world. And so we're gonna look at that. And then what we've looked at so far is the miracles. His first miracle that he did was turning water into wine. And then there's several others that we've looked at so far. He goes around and he starts picking up his followers a little bit at a time. This is I think this is one of the things that even I didn't realize as I read the Word and studied. I've gone through and I've been reading the New Testament in the chronological order. I've always kind of just felt that Jesus went and he got the 12 and then he started doing his ministry. But what's interesting is he picked up the 12 as he was doing his ministry. There was a lot of things that he had already done before he got to the number 12. And so it's interesting to see that, and we're going to look at that a little bit more next week as we get through that. He did a lot of walking, which everyone did in that day. But I meant to sit down and look and just see like how much walking he would have done. But what's interesting as we looked at the one thing is he walked in areas where most people wouldn't walk, or especially Jewish people wouldn't walk. And he went in areas that an upstanding Jewish person wouldn't go through. Go ahead.
If I'm not wrong, the only recorded time in the Bible that he actually rode on an animal was the triumph.
Yep, when he
Do you remember another time?
I think that's the only one.
Yeah, I don't.
When he rode into Jerusalem, yeah. And that was I know a lot of people did use donkeys and camels and things like that for transportation, but walking was the standard means of transportation back then. Yeah. Yeah, he did a little bit of sailing, all right? And he even walked on water, right? And he does a lot of walking. Shorter trips when you can just walk across the lake, right, or the sea instead of having to go around it. And then the last thing we hit was his conversation with the Samaritan woman. And I spent actually 2 weeks on that. And the reason I spent almost 2 weeks on that, because I think that's important to see how he interacted with people. One, not only women, but people who were considered lower, not just lower class, but almost trash. If you look at it in that day and age, and we say this, and it's, I think some people say we say it because for emphasis or to explain a point, but this is actually the truth. There were dogs that had more value a lot of times, or animals, farm animals that had more value a lot of times than women did in that day and age. And so for Jesus to spend the time that he did with a woman, one even talking to a woman in that day and age, it shows where he was and where his mindset was and where his heart was. He saw everyone as the same. He had love and compassion for it. Didn't matter if you were a leopard on the street, or a woman in this day and age, or someone who was high-ranking, whatever. He didn't give special treat. In fact, he kind of flipped it most of the time. Those who were the higher-ups or the political leaders or the spiritual leaders of the time, he usually went after them. Yeah. Yeah. It's easy when you got all the knowledge of the world or universe, right?
So that's why it's important to study.
Mm-hmm.
And even us studying, we're still going to fall way short of God himself.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. So, it's just, like I said, us being human is just uncomfortable when we're put in that type of situation.
It is.
Most of the time we're going to kind of shy away from it.
Yep. Yeah. And he walked right into it every time.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the woman at the well is one of my favorite stories because I love seeing the compassion he had for human beings. and it points to, why he did what he did and why he died for us. And so we kind of stopped there. Now, what I was going to do is I was going to keep just going story by story through Jesus' entire ministry. And I'm still going to do that a little bit going forward, but I'm going to change the perspective and I think the points a little bit as we go through it. And I want to try to apply it more to where we're at today, because I think that's important. I think that's the purpose of why we have the Bible, not only to better ourselves, but again to show us how we are to be in whatever given time, generation, or world that we're in. And like I said in the beginning, we are in a very different world than we were 2 years ago. I mean, if you think 2 years ago, it would have been 2019? So September of 2019, we were planning our trunk or treat, getting ready to have a big, expecting 500-600 people to cram on here and all be together. And, we were hitting 195, 199, 200 people seated in here on a regular basis. The idea of driving to work and sitting at a desk and sitting in an office or a cubicle wasn't a foreign thing. Going to a buffet, no, well, some of us, but most people were like, okay, I'm going to go to a buffet. There's no big deal. I'll go down to Old Times and get me a good meal. And we look today, and the idea of driving to work is now foreign for a lot of people. I'll give you an example. So most of y'all know I work for Lowe's. Lowe's had to announce this past week because they had originally said, okay, because Lowe's had just built a multi-million-dollar building in downtown Charlotte, huge 30-some, I think 40-some story building. They said, yeah, everyone's going to be going back to work. Well, guess what happened whenever the company decided that everyone had to go back to work into the buildings? Anyone want to guess? They said, no, we don't. I got 50 companies out here offering me a job where I can stay at home, and I don't have to spend 3 hours a day driving. I don't have to pay $600 a month for someone to watch my kids. All these things. It's actually more work's getting done. And so what's happened is we have what's called the Great Resignation, especially in the IT world. And the reason they're calling it the Great Resignation because they say within the next 2 years they expect 50% of people in the IT world to either quit their jobs or transition to another company. I mean, you're talking about 50% of the workforce. That's a lot of people. Go ahead. The other thing that's come up is people have realized, from what they're showing so far, people have realized that the work-life balance, that life is a lot more important than work. So you have a lot of either going to another, and some of them are quitting altogether because now that you have a parent at home and they don't have all these extra expenses because they're not having to pay a ton of money for kids to watch their children, stuff like that. It's actually more cost effective for one of the parents to stay at home. So you're seeing a lot of that as well. But what we're seeing is this massive shift, unlike anything we've seen over such a short period of time. And people are realizing, you know what? My life is too important to spend most of it driving to work every day and sitting in a cubicle all the time. So they are changing industries. There are a lot of people starting their own businesses. A lot of people, going a lot more than would have in the past. And so you're seeing this huge shift there. We're seeing it shift. I mean, we're seeing shifts in the way we eat out. We're seeing people who don't want to work in the food industry. They don't want to work in you go anywhere nowadays and you're going to have to wait 3 times, 4 times longer than what you ever used to have to wait when you go to a restaurant or somewhere. And so there's just been this massive, massive shift. But there's also been a very massive shift, and I don't think we realize it yet, and I don't know if we understand the full scope of it, when it comes to church and religion and spirituality. And I'll give you an example, and we'll go through this. So Barna, they're trying to stay. They're doing their best to stay on top of the current shift in church culture. And they're Barna Research Group. And so the latest numbers that came out within the last couple of weeks show this: 41% of Gen Z and 42% of millennials say that when COVID is over, they want to return to primarily in-person worship. So if that's 2 generations, and only 41 and 42% of them want to actually come back to worship inside a building. So 60% don't. Yeah, so this is they're polling people who, what we would consider churchgoers, or Christians, however you want to phrase it, but people who used to go to church on a regular basis. So that means the majority of Gen Z and millennials do not want to go back to in-person services in a building. And then if you take this a little bit further, it's 41, 42, and then my generation, Gen X, only 47% of them want to go back. So you have 3, which makes up a very good portion of the church world now, or even the world now, who do not want to come back to a building once this is done. If that whether
Along the time of this polling, did those other percentages in the 50-something%, did they actually say they won't, or they just kind of got used to the way it is? Or?
No, they say that they want. No, the other side of this want to come back.
I know, but they say that the other side, the 50-something%, they've actually said, "I will not return."
So it was broken down, and I want to say it was, I think, on average, somewhere around 20 that won't come back. Yeah. I'd have to go back and research and break those numbers down, but there was a decent percentage that said, "Hey, we're not going to come back. We're going to do our worship style differently." And so, when a lot of people hear this, they're like, "Oh, well, they don't want to come back to church." That's not necessarily true. And what they've seen is they. And I know this is hard, I think, because I look at, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, I think this is harder for the boomer generations and older to understand. And there's a lot of reasons, and we don't have time to get into all of it. But it's not, the people see this as like, oh, well, they've just given up on church, and they've given up on Jesus, and that's not true. But they've given up on the large corporate worship, where you pack 200, 300, 400, 500, 600 people in a room. What you're seeing from these newer generations and younger generations is they want to be part of more of a smaller, more intimate group of people who worship. So, and that's where we freak out. So we freak out. We see this as like, oh my gosh, most of the next 3 generations don't want to come back to church. In a sense, that's true. They don't want to come back to something like this. But it doesn't mean they don't want to worship. They want to worship in a smaller gathering of what we would see around maybe 15 to 20 people.
Again, I'm going by the poll, but did these folks say that was what they were going to do, find what we would call
I don't think it went that deep. I don't think it went that deep, but I think that was kind of from what they saw in that study, that was, and they are seeing a lot of this. What's interesting is what we would consider either the house church movement or the small group movement is exploding right now. It's becoming very popular.
That started happening back in the mid-90s in some of the bigger buildings and some of the mega churches, because people were feeling that they weren't getting to know everybody.
Yep. Yeah, because if you watch the trend, you saw you went from your 60s and 70s and 80s. Pretty much your average church size was probably around 100, 150, somewhere around in there. Not that, and then you get into the 90s, and then you had more of what we call the megachurch movement, right? It just kind of exploded, and that's kind of driven into even now. But what we've seen happening even before COVID happened was we saw this trend of the newer generation, the young generations wanting to get back into that more intimate setting. And so, like everything that's been just pushed, fast forwarded into the future 10 years with COVID, this has been one of those things. And so here's kind of what's interesting. There's a 30% gap between the boomer generation and Gen Z.
30% gap
in what? And those who want to come back. So 71% of the boomer generation, they want to come back to the corporate worship set. Which isn't, honestly, it's not an unexpected number. When I saw that, I was like, okay, that doesn't surprise me. So here's where this becomes a little bit of an issue. Anyone want to guess what the average age of a church minister or elder is? 35? 25? The average church leader is in their late 50s.
By church leaders, they're saying.
When I put this together, when I say average church leader, I'm talking about either, depending on how you define it, minister, pastor, or elder. I'm not talking about your deacons, or I'm talking about those who are responsible for leading and guiding the church. So what happens when, and I would honestly say, and if I were to pull this down into just the Church of Christ, I'd say this number probably goes up. I would probably say low 60s is the average in the Church of Christ.
I know congregations in our brotherhood that are begging 60 and 70, 80-year-old ministers not to retire because they're having a hard time replacing them.
So what happens then? So this is where I'm going. So what happens then when all of your church leaders are 59 and above, and they're trying to lead an entire generation that's way different, that's 30 points different than them in that?
Should be an older generation, I think. With the experience and all, and I don't think you could have younger ones in every shift position. That's my view on it.
And so, what happens when you do that, Andy? What happens when you only let the older generation be in leadership and none of the younger generation?
I don't think it's a matter of, there's a lot of ways you can be in leadership
Yep.
and not be an elder.
Yep.
I don't think there needs to be, quote, a generation gap in the church.
But I don't think there should be either.
Everybody to serve in some capacity.
But
regardless of their age.
there shouldn't be, but there is. If we look at it, there is. I mean, we struggle to get elders at all. We struggle a lot of times to get deacons. And and we see a huge gap right now in these two.
I'm sorry, I don't want to get you off your point.
No, you're fine.
But don't we still have to, the Word of God says, like we're just talking eldership, I mean, that person has to desire that job, and, a lot of times, they don't need to be taught.
No, they shouldn't be.
They should want it, but, I don't know, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but, like Andy was talking about, the elder and everything, he's, needs to know the Word of God, not necessarily learn it on the fly.
Let me ask a question, Troy. What do you think the average age of an elder was in the church? In the first century church? Back then?
In the first century,
First century church. What do you think the average age of an elder was?
20s, 30s. Very young, because the death rate, average age you live was a lot less than what it is.
Yeah.
So they were like,
Well, how long had many of the elders in the church at that time been Christians?
very short.
And now I'm not saying that we should go and make fresh Christians who are in their 20s, right, elders? But what I'm saying is we've set this standard, and I really didn't plan on getting into this, but we've set this standard that almost trying to be careful how I word this. Because I don't want to be, I'm not trying to be disrespectful at all, but we've kind of set this standard that unless you hit a certain age, then you can be an elder, right? You have to be an age, and then you can be an elder. And you don't see that anywhere in the Bible.
Yeah, but then again, we see the members of the LDS, Latter-day Saints, Mormons, I think, we see these elders riding around.
Yeah, well, I think you're.
I know what you're saying. But, here in the church, we bash that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We bash that, and I don't know. I mean, I know the church back then, like you talk about, the church back then was different than necessarily the church today. But then we want to, go back to elder. I don't want to get off
Yeah.
the thing, but
It's and here's where we're at as a church. Here's where we're at. We don't have a lot of youth coming and staying. We know that. We've seen that. The numbers somewhere around 60 to 65% that are leaving. All right? So we're not bringing a generation up to be leaders in the church for the most part. All right? And then we put this weird cap a lot of times on who can be in those positions. Now, I'm not talking about biblical stuff, right? I'm talking about if you don't meet the biblical standard, then obviously we don't need to be making people deacons or elders or preachers or anything, right? And so, but this is where the point that I was trying to get to originally, is we have this huge gap right now, and it needs to be closed, and it needs to be closed really quick, because if it's not, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. We're already seeing that. And so I don't have all the answers around that, but we can see it. All right? We can see that the preachers and our elders are aging, and not to be morbid, but they're aging and they're dying. And we don't have a lot of people coming behind them to fill that gap. And so, no, this isn't. But what's happened, like I said, like everything else, COVID has accelerated all that, right? It's just everything has been accelerated. So what was becoming a small issue is now become a much larger issue, and things that trends have become. Not only we were running up this, if things were running up this slow, they just shot straight up. And so this is something that we need to. So what my thought is, as I go through what we're going to be studying, one through Jesus and then through the New Testament church as we go through this, is back to the old 90s bracelet, WWJD. And here's why I say this, and I hope that we can go back to this. If you look at the church that we are in today, the church world, I'm not talking about just Church of Christ, the church world we live in today, it was designed for people and generations out of the 1800s, late 1800s, and early 1900s. If you look at the way we do things, and I'm not saying those things were wrong. That was effective, right? But if you look at the church and how things are, it's really not much more different than what it was back then, right? For the most part. And we've added some better technology and some newer things, but the way we go about things really hasn't changed that much. And we're seeing now, I think, the effects of that. Because a lot of times in the church world, we don't like change. And it's like, this is how we've always done it, so we need to continue doing it this way. And I get that. But we're going to have to really examine that. And I think one of the things, again, and I'm going to be careful how I say this, the Church of Christ model is structured around what the early church did. All right? And we tend to focus more on what I guess the big term is acts, right? We have our acts of worship, we have our acts or / steps of salvation, and we have all these things. And not to say that a lot of these things aren't important, I'm not saying that. But our focus has been so much on doing those things to be like the New Testament church that we've forgotten that we need to be like Jesus to be more like the New Testament church. And what I mean by that is, and we're seeing this today. We're seeing this, I think, a lot of times. Is now that the acts that we usually tend, that kind of defined us of who we were and made us the Church of Christ, now that a lot of those are sometimes a little bit harder, or we're having to skip services like we did the last two weeks, and then last year for 6 months, we feel a little lost. Because we're not doing those acts that we felt made us the church or Christians. Do y'all understand what I'm saying? Okay. I want to So here's my thing. I think if we got back to, and I wrote this down, and I hope this doesn't offend anyone, I think we need a new restoration movement. But instead of a restoration movement that goes back to being like the first century church, we need a restoration movement whose focus is being like Jesus. And in doing that, we will then really be what the first century church was. Does that make sense? And so I think I saw a video the other day, and it was a lady just talking, and she said that, the past few generations, the boomer and the older generations, they've been praying for a restoration of the church, right? Let's get the church, let's restore the church. Let's get that passion and stuff back for a Christian and in Jesus. And she made a good point, and that looks like that's happening, but it's not happening in the way that the previous generation thought it would happen. And so it bothers them a little bit. And I think there's some truth to that.
Let me ask you, and like you said, I'm not trying to be controversial at all. I'm just wondering, so far, and maybe I'm just out of the loop, so far I've not seen it happening during this post-COVID. I mean, I know it's changed the way we worship. A lot of people's online, a lot of people want to meet in their house churches, but I've personally not seen in the church a whole lot of souls being won and lives being changed from that quote house church movement.
Because it's not happening in the church.
Okay.
It's not happening. It's happening some in the small church movement. We're seeing a little bit of that. You know where it's happening? You know where people are going because they have tons of questions right now and they're seeking answers? You know where they're going? They're going online. I will say right now, and I try to keep up with, and even being in the IT world, it's getting harder for me to keep up with it. I would say one of the areas that especially the younger generations are looking at for their spiritual advice and asking most of their questions. You want to know what the number one source probably is right now? Most of y'all probably have never even heard of it or seen it. TikTok. And I'm dead. We laugh at that, but I'm dead serious. It's called TikTok. It's a platform where you can post videos about a million different things. Usually 1 minute to 3 minutes. But people are asking a lot of questions there, and they're getting a lot of wrong answers. Yep. And so, I've got to stop because we're at 10:16. But the motto of people coming here and asking questions or looking for answers, that day is way over with, for the most part. I mean, you might get a small amount. So we're going to have to shift, and we're going to have to shift in a large way. And some people aren't going to be comfortable with it. But we need to look at it. So what I'm going to do as we continue through this, I'm going to show how Jesus changed where he was, and what if you look at the shift that was going on in their culture, we're going to look at that. And then we're going to look at the New Testament church and what they did to shift their culture and went against the things that was going on, and show how they adapted it and how we can use the same process and the same things that they did for our time. So we'll start in that next week, and we'll get started. Thank you.